So many demos came out during Summer Games Fest and Steep Next Fest that have basically created a backlog for myself at this point. Mortal Shell 2, Onimusha, Valor Mortis, The Sinking City 2, there's a lot to get through. Now, out of all of those, The Sinking City 2 was probably the one I was the most curious about. I've always had a soft spot for Lovecraftian horror. There's just something about stories involving ancient gods and people losing their minds. A lot of games try to capture that feeling, some do it pretty well, and most don't. Then there's The Sinking City. The first game was pretty weird. It was janky and the animations looked a little rough, the open world felt pretty repetitive, yet somehow I ended up loving it anyway. Not so much because of the gameplay, but everything surrounding it. The detective work was fun with a really unique atmosphere where the city itself felt miserable in the best possible way. Every time you met somebody new, there was a decent chance they were either involved in a cult, ritual sacrifice, or some other completely insane thing. Sometimes all three. So, when Frogwares announced The Sinking City 2 and started talking about a bigger focus on survival horror, I was interested, but also a little worried about just how modern they wanted to take it. Before the demo even starts, the game gives you a few difficulty options. You've got Sweet Dreams for people who mostly want the story, Restless Slumber as a standard setting, Hard Night, and then Sleep Demon if you apparently enjoy suffering. Now, I already knew Frogwares had been talking about leaning harder into survival horror this time around. They've mentioned Resident Evil as one of the inspirations behind the sequel. What I didn't expect was seeing them openly explain investigations would play a smaller role than they did in the original game. That kinda irked me a bit because investigations weren't some side activity in the first Sinking City, they were the whole point really. Shooting monsters and moving to the next objective was mostly just background filler. The real meat of the game was digging through archives, interviewing squid head cultists, following clues across Oakmont, and trying to piece together what actually happened. Sometimes you'd make the wrong call, sometimes you'd completely misread a situation. The game trusted you to figure things out. So seeing that disclaimer before the demo even began definitely raised an eyebrow. The second warning was a little less surprising. The devs come right out and tell you that the demo still has a ways to go with optimization, and so I didn't think much about it. Still, warnings aside, curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see how all of these changes actually felt, and you can already see what Frogwares had in mind. The demo opens with a meeting inside a restaurant, and before long, you run into the first major change. Reed is gone.
Is this seat taken?
Who's asking?
A handsome stranger.
Dime a dozen.
Sorry I'm late.
Did you get it? Was there any trouble?
I never get in trouble.
You get in trouble all the time.
If you played the original game, you'll probably remember Charles Reed. He wasn't exactly the most charismatic dude ever created. The guy spent most of the game looking like an anorexic, frail emo boy getting over a hangover that was vaguely uncomfortable about everything happening around him. Which, to be fair, is probably the correct reaction when you're wandering around a flooded city full of fish people and eldritch cults. This time around, we're following Calvin Rafferty, basically a Nathan Drake clone.
Faye Adelaide Bennett.
Calvin!
Will you contact a god with me?
You... The Book of Dreaming, you did get it. Oh, you have some nerve getting on one knee. You're lucky to walk out of this room alive after a stunt like that.
Sorry, baby. We've got visitors.
Trouble?
Oh, no. Probably after someone else.
Calvin Rafferty, freeze!
What are the odds?
He's quicker with his responses and quips, more on the Marvel random joke kind of side. Now, that caught me off guard a little bit. The dialogue definitely had a different sort of energy to it. At first, I wasn't entirely sure how I felt about it because some exchanges felt a bit more modern than I expected from a Lovecraft-inspired setting. Then the story starts revealing pieces of what's actually happening and things settle down a bit. We learned that Calvin and his lady friend Faye participated in some kind of ritual involving dreams and something went very wrong. Faye is left in a coma, leaving Calvin to try to understand what happened, and before long you've got the first real mystery driving the story forward. It's not a huge amount of setup, but it's enough to establish a goal and get you moving through a surprisingly good-looking world. And that right there is definitely one of the biggest surprises, the city itself. I mean, the first game had a certain charm to it, but let's be honest, after enough hours you started recognizing a lot of the same buildings because of how often assets were reused across the map. This feels different. You begin by traveling through flooded streets on a small boat, weaving through the remains of Arkham while rain falls across rooftops and abandoned buildings. Before long, you start spotting signs of the slither infestation spreading throughout the city. These strange worm-like creatures that have become part of the everyday life for the poor souls still stuck here.
The slither. Foul worms that arrived with the flood. Now they're everywhere.
And once you finally step off the boat, that's when the extra details really start becoming noticeable. Buildings aren't just there to fill space. You actually weave through apartments, shops, offices, radio stations, and narrow streets, flooded alleys, and interiors that all feel like somebody actually sat down and thought about how people lived there before everything went completely off the rails. The city feels abandoned, but not empty. Every room tells a little story about the people who occupied them before they either fled, died, joined the cult, grew tentacles, or whatever combination of those options tend to happen in Lovecraftian settings. Instead of one giant open world, the demo points toward larger interconnected zones that are much more focused. You still have room to explore, but the game seems more interested in directing you through handcrafted spaces than dropping you into a massive city and letting you wander for hours. The moment you start moving through the city on foot, you can feel the shift. The camera swings behind Calvin's shoulder and the environments become tighter. The pacing slows down a bit, with it feeling a lot closer to modern survival horror. You even get what is essentially a safe room between major sections, a place where you can save your progress, no ink ribbon needed. You can also access your stash and take a breather before heading back into whatever fresh nightmare is waiting outside. If you spent any amount of time in Resident Evil, Dead Space, or similar games, the inspiration is pretty obvious. The demo constantly pushes you towards new locations and new encounters. Eventually, one of these paths leads you towards your first real encounter with the Slither, which is where the game finally gets to show off its improved combat. The first real enemy encounter does a pretty good job of showing what Frogwares was aiming for with the sequel. You start off with a fairly basic pistol, nothing fancy, no ridiculous supernatural weapons, yet. Then you run into your first victim of the Slither.
Disgusting. Hey. Hey, no. Stay back, or I'll shoot.
This scene reminded me a bit of the first zombie scene from Resi 1 or even the transformations in Dead Space. The pistol has a nice punch to it, with enemies actively reacting to your shots when you hit them in their tumorous growths. Landing hits actually feel satisfying. You also have some basic dodge attacks to help you create space and reposition. And if things get too close, you can start throwing hands. There's something oddly satisfying about unloading a few rounds into a squid-faced fishman then punching him in the face. And in classic fashion, survival horrors tend to limit your resources. Demo gives you enough to survive, but not enough that you can simply spray bullets at every problem you encounter. You can craft ammunition and healing supplies, though the system is still fairly basic in the demo. I imagine that will expand quite a bit in the full release. What surprised me most is how much more confident the combat feels compared to the original game. The first Sinking City had combat because it needed combat. This feels like the combat the developers actually wanted players to engage with. And while I was having a pretty good time shooting monsters, there was one area where I couldn't help noticing something had changed. Although I was enjoying the combat, I kept waiting for the game to give me one of those moments that made the first Sinking City stand out from everything else. If you never played the original, a huge part of that game revolved around investigations. Not the kind where a glowing marker tells you exactly where to go next, but actual detective work. You'd gather evidence from multiple locations, dig through archives, interview people, compare conflicting information, and then eventually decide what you thought had happened. Sometimes your conclusion was right, and sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes you'd only realize you made the wrong choices hours later. Now that system wasn't perfect, but it made you feel involved in the mystery. The demo takes a much lighter approach. As I explored the city, I still found clues and pieces of information scattered throughout the environment. The detective elements haven't disappeared completely, but they seem to have been streamlined quite a bit. Most of what I encountered involved finding a handful of clues and connecting them together before moving on to the next objective. The process felt quicker and more direct and far less demanding than what I remember from the first game. Now maybe that's intentional, this is a demo after all. Frogwares could simply be introducing players to the basics before opening things up later in the campaign. I certainly hope that's the case because some of my favorite moments in the original came from getting lost in an investigation and trying to figure out what the hell was actually going on. And to be clear, I'm not saying the new approach is bad. I just found myself missing some of that slower detective work that made Oakmont feel unique. That's really the biggest thing I'm still unsure about after finishing the demo. Like I said, the combat is much stronger now, and the city itself is a lot more detailed. The overall production value has clearly gone up across the board. But when I think back to why I love the original game, my mind always goes back to the investigations first. I'm a little worried about the need for games to cater too much to the famous modern audience nowadays. So I'm very curious to see how much of that side of the experience survives in the full release. Also, on a positive note, Frogwares has gotten a lot better at creating horror. One thing I noticed pretty quickly is that the sinking city seems much more confident about letting the world speak for itself. The original game had atmosphere, but it often relied on the setting alone to carry that feeling.
Worms.
This time, the presentation feels much more deliberate. Rain bounces off rooftops, buildings creak in the distance, and water laps against flooded streets. Somewhere nearby, another unfortunate resident of Arkham is probably experiencing an eldritch nightmare beyond human comprehension. The more focused structure helps a lot too. Instead of spending long periods crossing open sections of a city, you're constantly moving through interiors, alleyways, abandoned businesses, and other spaces that create tension naturally. Every doorway felt worth checking. Even the smaller interactions contribute to that feeling. Opening a safe, solving a simple puzzle, checking a side room for supplies. None of these moments are particularly complicated on their own, but together they create a rhythm that helps keep you engaged with the environment. What impressed me the most is that the city feels lived in. Or maybe lived in isn't quite the right phrase. It feels like people were here recently. As you're moving through these buildings, you keep finding little details that suggest life simply stopped one day and never really started again.
Greetings, brothers and sisters of Arkham. Mushroom Jack back again, broadcasting from up here in my Ark. And today, as the last boat sweep the city, I have a tale for you. A man and his family were eating dinner when there came a knock at the door. On the third day, the man came home to find the woman had called early, and his wife had invited her in for dinner. And dine she did, dear listener, upon his wife's flesh.
The city doesn't feel like a video game level designed around combat encounters anymore. I mean, they are, but not as video gamey as before. I think that's why I spent so much time poking around side rooms and checking every building I could enter, even when there wasn't a reward waiting for me. I wanted to see what was there. Lovecraftian horror usually works best when you're uncovering fragments of something larger, instead of having the entire mystery dumped in your lap. The city itself ends up telling a part of the story if you're willing to slow down and pay attention to it. Then Frogwares reminded me of something else they were always very good at, creating absolutely insane characters. Near the end of the demo, I ran into somebody who felt like he walked straight out of the first game. For most of the session, the supernatural elements are always present, but they're mostly lurking in the background while the game introduces its mechanics and the world. Then, a giant crab squid monstrosity decides to remind you what kind of universe you're actually playing in. The encounter comes out of nowhere and does a pretty good job of shifting the focus back towards the larger mystery. What caught my attention wasn't even the creature itself, it was Calvin. The demo keeps dropping little pieces of info about him without ever giving you the full picture. Between the strange symbols covering his body, the dream ritual gone wrong, all those visions he keeps having, and the reactions other characters have towards him, feels pretty obvious that he's involved in whatever's happening in Arkham. A lot more than he realizes. At least that's my impression so far. By the time I reached the final areas of the demo, my brain was already trying to piece together some theories. Maybe Calvin has some forgotten connection to the cults operating throughout the city. Maybe he's tied to whatever entity is influencing the Slither. Or maybe he's just a whack job losing his mind in an insane asylum, which wouldn't be unusual in a Lovecraft-inspired story. The demo clearly wants you asking those questions.
They fed the Slither here like cattle. But why? These people are sick.
And while I don't think there's enough info yet to form any serious conclusions, I was at least interested in finding out more. What really sold me though was a character waiting near the end of the demo who felt like he had escaped directly from the first game.
Don't shoot. I am human. I am alive.
Put up your hands.
Yes, yes. Of course. I am Corentin. What's your name?
Calvin, turn around. Real slow.
Calvin, I have made some improvements, but I assure you all is well.
How are you? The worms only inhabit the dead.
Now this guy feels like classic Sinking City. Throughout the demo, I'd been noticing the changes Frogwares made to the formula, and then I met Corentin, and suddenly everything felt familiar again. So he, pulled out his own eyes and replaced them with living slither growths so he could study forbidden text and translate eldritch knowledge. You know, the usual. He's got a lot of insight, if you know what I mean. That's part of what I always enjoyed about the first game. Frogwares was never afraid to fill the world with people who had completely surrendered themselves to the madness. You'd walk into a room expecting a normal conversation and leave wondering what sort of eldritch fever dream you had just witnessed. Corentin brought back that feeling immediately. Nobody sat him down and explained why replacing your eyes with writhing parasites might be a bad idea. He simply decided the pursuit of knowledge was worth the trade. And you gotta admire that. And by that point, I was feeling pretty positive about the experience overall. The only real issue I noticed was performance. Before the demo even started, Frogwares warned that the game wasn't optimized yet, and after playing through the demo on multiple systems, I definitely get it. I ran into issues on both my laptop with a 4060 and my desktop with a 4070 Ti. The exact problems varied from area to area, but there were plenty of moments where frame rates would dip or hitching would appear while moving through certain locations. There were stretches where the game ran perfectly fine, which actually made the rough patches stand out even more. Part of me isn't worried yet because this is exactly the sort of thing demos are meant to work out. At the same time, the release window is only a couple of months from now. The challenge now is making sure all of that runs consistently when the full game arrives. I'm still optimistic about the game itself. I just hope they listen to feedback and make sure performance is up to par. So after spending a few hours with the demo, I think Frogwares is mostly moving in the right direction. The combat feels significantly better than it did in the first game, which isn't exactly a difficult achievement, but they've done much more than simply make shooting feel serviceable. Encounters are more engaging, and I actually found myself looking forward to them instead of just trying to run through them. The city itself is also a huge step forward. Arkham actually feels more detailed, the environments are much more memorable, and exploring buildings became one of my favorite parts of the demo. There are plenty of moments where I found myself wandering through building and taking in all the extra details. As for the story, it's still far too early for me to have a strong opinion one way or the other. The setup is interesting as Calvin clearly has more going on that we've been told, although I do hope some of his dialogue improves as the game progresses. Because as I said, there were a few conversations that felt a little rough around the edges, but overall still good. Oh, and I'm still worried about the investigation system. Games that let you play without holding your hand the entire time are so uncommon these days. The detective work in this demo felt much lighter by comparison. That doesn't necessarily mean it's gone, but I definitely want to see more of it before launch. What makes this sequel interesting is that Frogwares seems to be pulling inspiration from several different directions at once. The over-the-shoulder perspective, resource management, safe rooms, and combat encounters clearly push things closer to Resident Evil than the first game ever was. Some of the environmental puzzles and exploration reminded me a bit of Silent Hill. Heck, even the way you can stomp enemies, manage ammunition, and fight your way through infested buildings occasionally brought Dead Space to mind. The thing is, I don't need Frogwares to beat any of those games at what they do best. What I want is for them to keep the thing that made the Sinking City feel different in the first place. There are plenty of survival horror games out there. There are plenty of action horror games too. What made the original memorable was a combination of detective work, Lovecraftian storytelling, weird-ass characters, and the feeling that every answer you found only led to another mystery. And so, let me know what you think. Do you like the direction Frogwares is taking here, or would you rather they stay closer to the detective-focused design of the first game? And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.